All right. I don't know if this webcam is helping or not. All right. Welcome to the Pixel Latte show. Fuck. All right, we're rusty. Welcome to the Pixel Latte show. No, it's not the show. Welcome to Pixel Latte, a show about the intersection of pop culture, video games, politics, economics, just a lot of really god-awful depressing shit this week. I'm Lee, and I'm joined as always by my host, Jeff.
Hey, how you doing?
Man?
I'm doing great. I feel like a Jeff today. You know, it's a very Jeff feeling.
Yeah, not so much a Lewis. You know, you got a real Jeff vibe going on today. You know, which is definitely your name, right?
Yeah, it's definitely my name. You've got to work up to the Jeff vibes. It's not something you arrive at. You have to. It's practice. Jeff is a thing.
We are as consistent about the lore of this show as we are consistent with our recording schedule. Which is to say, not very consistent at all. As you can tell, we're a little bit rusty. It's been 6 months since we last talked. It's been, it's really crazy. First off, the channel, 11 subscribers, man. I checked today. Those are not rookie numbers. We have crossed into double-digit territory, and if we keep with this current rate, by the time the heat death of the universe comes, we might have as many subscribers as PewDiePie did in the early 2000s. So stick around for that update video. It's gonna be a killer. So yeah,
that's amazing. I think we've had 10% growth in the last month. One subscriber. That's nothing to balk at.
Yeah, 100% growth since we started the channel, so
yeah.
So yeah, and as you can tell, we have upgraded our sound recording situation here. We have purchased some wonderful old technology called blankets. And so if you hear us visibly sweating, that is because that is what is happening, and we're going to try to power through this. But hopefully you notice the difference.
Well, unlike Lee, I bought a sweat shield for my mic, so I'm not too worried about the sweat sounds, because I'm a Jeff.
Okay, so 6 months, a lot of crazy stuff has been happening. What's been going on with you, Jeff?
Trying to survive just generally and deal with the anxiety of living through both 2020 and now 2021. Which isn't to say that there wasn't any anxiety before, but it seems like a lot of various anxieties about the political situation, the ecological situation of the world, and all these other things. They're really coming to the fore, and it's hard to ignore them, but also escape them in a way. And so I think I've just been trying to get through. I'm a very fortunate tech worker, so I've been working at home, which comes with all of its pros and its various cons. But yeah, it's just been trying to live life as best I can in this continued pandemic. What about you, Lee?
Yeah, no. So I got a new job. I'm out of the arts industry, and I'm in, we'll just say, the policy and politics industry. And so it's I wanted to bring it up. It's relevant for the show because we're talking about a game. I don't want to spoil what this is. I'll let Jeff introduce the game. But occasionally, I may announce a conflict of interest, or moderate my position in a way that I wasn't if I was still working in the arts industry. And so that will come up later towards the end of this episode. And that's how we'll leave it. Well, I'll just leave it at that because I don't want to get doxxed and make my life more difficult than it already is. And life is pretty damn difficult. So with that in mind, Lee, why don't you introduce our game?
So this week we're talking about a very special game. It was released in 2020, and it's Umurangi Generation, which is a first-person shooter, and it takes place in the shitty future, which might or might not be influenced by our own world, where kaiju are attacking humans due to ecological collapse. More than that, you play a Maori character who works as a courier tasked with capturing photos in different settings. As you spend the final days before the apocalypse with your friends, the game conjures up various influences such as Jet Set Radio, Neon Genesis Evangelion, and Pokemon Snap, as well as many more. Though it has many influences, thinking of the game only through these influences don't really do it justice because it has a strong political message and it dives deep into topics such as identity and colonialism. With that said, Lee, is there anything that you would like to say about this game before we dive deep into it?
Oh man, there's so much I want to say about this game. I think a lot of people, this was a game that flew under the radars of a lot of just everyone. I would say in general last year, and it's a game that encapsulates and sort of it really speaks to our moment in so many ways. You know, the game is it's only about 6 hours, and I would say the game says more in 6 hours than most games say in 100 hours. You know, you talked about earlier in the intro about just living through like this ecological collapse and just the everything these days. And this is such a fitting game, and I can't help but feel like perhaps I don't know. It's just such a cool game in every way, and I'm so excited to talk about it today.
Yeah, and although Lee alluded to maybe conflicts of interest, don't think that we're going to hold back on diving deep into this game. There's a lot of political discourse that we'll get into, as well as many other parts of the game that talks on, kind of gets into various cultural topics. So, Lee,
And I
would you
will
like
also
to? Yes.
yeah, like I said, we're rusty. So I will just also say that if you care about spoilers, I'm very sorry. This video is not for you. Maybe keep listening to the video, but don't watch it, because so much of what makes this game special is that the storytelling is told through the environment. And again, this game is about 6 hours long, and a lot of this environmental storytelling, it sort of unfolds and you get a bigger idea of sort of like what is happening to these people in the world that they live in. And again, 6 hours long, so you're probably going to see most of the game during this conversation. Is not going to be 6 hours long, I hope, but you'll get a really good idea of what's going on. So
Yeah, and I think it sometimes helps to indulge in spoilers before playing a game, but there's a lot about the tone and the interesting ways that the narrative of this game twist as you're playing it, that if you're interested in this game, I would recommend maybe playing it before diving into this. And with that said, we're going well beyond complete spoilers here. Every facet of this game is going to be opened. We're going to dive into everything, so everything about this game will be covered in some way. Lee, with that said, would you like to break us into some of the conversations this game has on settler colonialism?
yeah, my pleasure. So as Jeff, that's your name this week, I believe. As Jeff alluded to at the top, you're playing a Maori courier. You're photographing the end of the world, and this game has a lot of not so nice, and I would say very appropriate things to say about neoliberalism, environmental collapse, and all that other. I don't want to say good stuff, so we'll just say stuff. But for me, you really can't talk about sort of the way neoliberalism. You can't talk about neoliberalism without talking about settler colonialism, and the fact that this game puts Maori identity front and center is just so radical. So I just want to spend a little bit of time on that. So what do I mean when I say settler colonialism? Settler colonialism, it's sort of if it's sort of the reason neoliberalism exists in a way, right? So settler colonialism is when an imperial power seeks to replace the land's original population through violent depopulation, assimilation, or repression. So you're not just merely exploiting or destroying sort of an existing indigenous population, you are perpetually replacing them. And this is often through interlocking forms of oppression, so racism, white supremacy, unfettered capitalism, and there's almost always some form of resource extraction or exploitation of natural resources and their people. And so settler colonialism is the reason why the United States, Great Britain, Germany, France, pick any country that's in the G8, or what was formerly known as the G8, and that is why they are dominating global politics today. And so what you see is that under settler colonialism, the mere expression of one's identity is an act of bravery, because they're seeking to replace you as a person, your identity, your cultural identity. One of the many countries that engages this was, of course, the United States. And they were so successful in sort of replacing, or successful to an extent, replacing sort of the Native American people, that Nazi Germany looked to America as an example when basing their policies towards Jewish people. And so what America did, and what you see happening in countries all across the world, including what is now known as New Zealand, is that at a very early age, children are sent to boarding schools, their language, their religion, their culture sort of stripped away. Here in America, even the hair was cut because long hair was seen as savage and thus an impediment to civilization. And there was sort of this sense that this was an act of kindness, right? That these people were eventually going to die away, which of course they didn't. Famously, the Carlisle industrial school's motto was "Kill the Indian, save the man." And there's more to that quote that I definitely cannot say on the show.
That's just one example, though, right? And I think there is a tendency to look at these examples of settler colonialism and even genocide, right, in a sort of narrow way. We think of it in the United States as in our past. Many countries think of it as in their past. But I think that does a bit of an injustice to it because it doesn't recognize a lot of the events that led up to those moments of settler colonialism, but it also doesn't do justice to the kind of more contemporary examples, such as with the Armenian and Turkish conflict. You have the Kurds, and then even the Uyghur Muslims, right? And all of them are going through their various crises, or trying to deal with the various genocides that have plagued them in the past. And so I think it's when we talk about these things, it's important to not just think of these things as gross events that existed in the past and that we collectively have moved beyond them, but they are these events of genocide, cultural erasure, settler colonialism. They still exist and they still happen largely throughout the world today.
Well, and to your point, even if they do, even if they are in the past, like say what the American government did to the original nations of North America and beyond, they're those ramifications, they echo for centuries. And that definitely happened in New Zealand. Again, Maori children, just like their counterparts in the United States, they were sent to boarding schools. They were punished for speaking their language. And so as a result, many of those kids chose not to pass on that language to their children. And then you see that because they've been removed from their land, either through trickery. There's the Treaty of Waitangi. I encourage everyone to sort of go into that. We don't have time to go into that today, but that is very important to the sort of current state of Maori people, right? Once you take away their land, once you take away their resources, of course, they're not going to be able to sort of achieve the same outcomes as their Anglo counterparts, right? And so what we see today is that even though the Maori are just 17% of New Zealand's population, they make up 52% of its prison population. We see that they have worse health and education statistics compared to their European-descended counterparts. And these disparities, they exist even when you account for poverty, education, location. Like once those are eliminated, those disparities are still there. And that is pretty much true in just pick a Western country and in an indigenous group that they tried to replace. And I just want to stress that so much of this is generational. I just want to stress that point. I'm Korean, and I'm not going to pretend that like the Korean people, I don't want to like play the oppression Olympics here, but definitely some bad shit happened to Koreans. And my mother, she gave me a European name because she didn't want anybody to make fun of me growing up as a kid. And of course they found ways to make fun of me because kids are really freaking cruel. So on this show, I go by my Korean family name. And again, that's just like a minor thing, right? Like no one has stripped away my rights, or my mother's rights, but it is definitely a thing that happens. And so again, going back to that idea of what does it mean to be an indigenous person and represented in video games? And so I want to read a quote from Fritz Scholder, a influential Luciano Native American artist who was around in about I want to say the 60s or 70s. I'm forgetting my art history. But he summed up about 400 years of indigenous representation, really just like in a way that sort of like just rings sadly true. And so he writes, people really don't like their Indians. Oh, they like their own conception of the Indian, usually the Plains Indian, romantic and noble and handsome, and somehow the embodiment of wisdom and patience. But Indians in America are usually poor, sometimes derelicts outside the value system, living in uncomfortable surroundings. We have really been viewed as something other than human beings by larger society. And so what he's sort of getting at here is that when we think of indigenous people, again, just pick one. We really just see them as like sort of one thing. It's like sort of the savage or perhaps the noble savage. Or in the case of the Maori, I think what a lot of people think of is some, buff Wellington dude who sort of like, covered in tattoos either on his face or his arm, and he's doing the haka, right? And so that's usually what gets represented in video games. And even if video games do get the cultural representation correct, so just to be clear, there are more types of Maori than very attractive New Zealand dudes doing the haka, right? There's more than Jason Momoa out there. Actually, I don't even know if Jason Momoa is Maori. You might need to fact check me on that real quick. But even when they do get it correct, like say for example Assassin's Creed 3, where they worked with cultural experts within the Mohawk community, they got the clothing, the language correct as far as I can tell. But in the game, you still end up helping colonizers colonize, right? And to be sure, there is historical basis in that particular incident. But when that is the only story you tell, the noble savage helping the colonizer colonize, or the buff Wellington doing the haka, that is such a huger service. There's such a broader range of what it means to be a Maori person, or to be a Native American, or to be Korean, whatever, than just what is shown. Jeff, did you have something you wanted to jump in with?
Absolutely. There were several other kind of critical examples here of contemporary games with problematic representation of First Nations people that I think I wanted to go over. So Civilization 6, they added a character, Chief Poundmaker, to the game that you could play as. And I think that in doing so, they kind of perpetuated a lot of the same issues that you brought up with Assassin's Creed. In that you play that game, Civilization is a game largely through the lens of colonial intent and expansionist means. You try to expand or colonize the world, and that is kind of a win state. And even kind of peaceful or pacifist, so-called pacifist ways of kind of winning are often through a very American lens, right? And so including someone of the First Nation, Chief Poundmaker, in this game, and a game where like the means of winning are colonial or are often through a lens that is not very consistent with the views of First Nations people, is very problematic in a lot of ways. Another example would be the Red Dead Redemption series, where while there are some distinctive roles for Native Americans, the vast majority, I'd say like 99% of them that you encounter in the game, perpetuate the myth that Native Americans were hostile or openly hostile to settlers, which is not at all the case, right? In many cases, they were actually very peaceful and continued to embrace settlers in various ways through their egalitarian means, that they ran their own encampments and communities with, and it was us that fought back against them. So it kind of perpetuates this myth that is harmful to the history of what happened here. Really what a lot of this says to me, though, is that earlier when we were talking about events of settler colonialism, that isn't really the proper way to think about it, in that settler colonialism is a history. It is something that continues to exist and marginalizes people and their representation. And so I think it's important that we don't try to think of settler colonialism as kind of like encapsulated events. Like America is beyond its First Nations issues with the Native Americans. We have moved beyond that when we certainly haven't. We're still living through the legacy of many of the bad decisions and continue to make many bad decisions that are very harmful to many people.
Yeah, and I just want to acknowledge that even, Jeff and I talking about it is I don't want to use the word problematic because I think that word gets overused, but it's hard for us to talk about this in a way that is fully accurate and does the situation justice. Like I said, I'm Korean. I would describe Jeff as aggressively Caucasian. Like you could probably see through him in certain circumstances. So I would encourage listeners, if you are interested in this stuff, there is a wealth of resources out there from cultural experts, from cultural historians, that have first-hand, second-hand, third-hand accounts of this. And that this knowledge is often not, these experiences are often not written down. There is a strong preference for the written word. And in many cases, this stuff is passed down orally. So I encourage you to go out and seek those resources out because they do exist. YouTube is good for at least one thing.
At the very best, the best that Lee and I, but a mere Jeff, can do is introduce this topic to our dear listeners and viewers. And so I echo what Lee said, and that if you are interested in this, and you should be, do seek out better and more familiar sources with this information with firsthand, secondhand, and thirdhand accounts. It's difficult to do this topic justice in our current situation.
Yeah. So with that disclaimer out of the way, let's talk about the game we're supposed to be talking about today, which is Umurangi Generation, which again has a strong, there is Maori cultural identity oozing from this game. Like even the name Umurangi Generation, it translates to Red Sky Generation, which is a reference both to the bushfires that inspired the game's development back in, what was it, 2020, I think?
It would be 2020. This game was, the way this game developed seems to have been pretty quick, and it was a reflection upon, events that were happening in 2020, particularly in the developer's life, Tali Faulkner, I believe.
Yeah. And so there's that. So, and then all the levels, they are called by their Maori name, because again, under settler colonialism, words have immense power. And the game takes great pains to call people and places by their non-English names. There are also just symbols of Maori identity just everywhere in the game. They're worn by your friends. One of the characters looks like she's got like two pointy black bits poking out of her head. Those are actually huia feathers in her hair, which is an now extinct bird that is sacred to Maori people. Another one, sports a jacket with a supernatural taniwha, which is this supernatural being. There's the repeated appearance of the funny. I'm not gonna try this one. I practice, but I can't say it. It's a meeting house, basically, the central hub. And in the walled city level, there's a manaya, which is a stylized mythological feature, and also the level itself is a sort of like cool meta commentary on the game. The level's name is a reference to Kowloon Walled City, which is a city near Hong Kong that existed outside the confines of competing imperial interests. You've probably seen this in pretty much any sort of cyberpunk movie that was made sort of before the city was ultimately destroyed and turned into a park. And then, of course, at the first level and the original next to last level of the game, there is Mount Maua, a sacred spot for many Maoris. So again, this game is just oozing with Maori identity. Most of it authentic, some of it not. The developer has gone on record saying that a lot of the symbols that you see that have a lot are intentionally wrong because he didn't want somebody getting a tattoo of it, sort of like the small charcoal grill incident that Ariana Grande had.
Oh no, yeah. One thing I really love about some of these presentational aspects of the game is how there's nuance and how a lot of it is being presented. One of my favorite examples, right, is that one of your friends in the game, she wears around a jacket, right, with various Maori symbols, but she also has a Union Jack on it, right? Identity in this isn't simply strictly like singular in a sense, right? There's a lot of duality to this and a lot of complexity in the various characters. Even though there's no dialogue in this game, you get a lot of depth out of the characters from the way they're presented and what they're wearing and what is represented on it.
Well, the jacket is such a great example. It's so subtle, it's not something that the game even asks you to photograph.
You could play the entire game and miss it. I actually played through the game several times before I found it.
Yeah, and it's, the reason I like it is because there's often this narrative when it comes to talking about indigenous groups that they're dead, that the cultural practitioners, their descendants, what have you, somehow their lives, their beliefs, their experiences aren't valid because there's no full-blooded Maori. And this is a huge problem, here in America because of very stupid blood laws. And so, it's so refreshing to see just modern indigenous people represented authentically in a game. It's not like Maori people have not been in video games before, but usually what happens is it's someone like Apex Legends Gibraltar, where again, it's that buff Wellington who, he's going to do the haka, even though it's usually a group thing, but don't worry about it. It's just, we can't have more than one Maori person in this game. Or perhaps, there will be oh my gosh, what's the a Tomoko option, which is sort of that face tattoo that we've come to associate with Maori people. That'll be some sort of option in the character creation screen, but it's totally divorced from its cultural context. I mean, face tattoos in indigenous groups, including the Maori, it's a visual language with very specific meanings, and to just toss it on, that's like it's like whenever a white person dresses up as a Native American for Halloween. It's like, no. So again, I am just so it's just so refreshing to me to see this.
And these contemporary representations, they eschew myths of what we would think, or what a lot of people would think that Maori people should look like. They don't have this sort of gross tribal stereotypes of what a Maori person should be or should look like. And in fact, I don't think I noticed it. There are tons of characters that you meet in this game, side characters, people just going through life in this apocalypse, right? But I scarcely remember anyone with face tattoos or kind of like diving into any of these stereotypical representations. The game goes very far into giving you an authentic experience of a contemporary Maori person, right? And that experience is complicated in so many ways. It doesn't just try to make things simple.
Yeah, I agree. I agree totally. So with that in mind, actually, despite us talking about this for, oh gosh, we are now, the uncut version is now approaching 30 minutes. The game is actually a large conversation, is mostly a conversation about neoliberalism, disaster capitalism, in the face of an ongoing ecological collapse. So I want to toss this over to you. Almost called you Lee. The person who is currently known as Jeff. I want to toss this over to you because I feel like in many ways this game for you sort of spoke to or sparked an ideological awakening of sorts, or affirmation perhaps.
Yeah, a metamorphosis, right? And so to me, the way this game spoke is that it is a tale, a story of neoliberalism and how it led to this situation, this ecological collapse, and also how we responded to it. But in order to really talk about neoliberalism, we have to kind of get to a common ground and how the game is approaching it. So Umurangi generation thinks of neoliberalism as a political project, which is, in the words of David Harvey, the author of the famous A Brief History of Neoliberalism, I've always treated neoliberalism as a political project carried out by the corporate capitalist class as they felt intensely threatened both politically and economically towards the end of the 1960s and into the 1970s. They desperately wanted to launch a political project that would curb the power of labor. So what this means, neoliberalism as a political project, is that it is sort of a counter-revolutionary movement in which the forces of organized labor and collective action were pushed down against to increase or hold the power of the corporate capitalist class. Corporations effectively hold the means of moving society forward, and capitalism is fundamentally a good thing, are core tenets of this. But important in this vision of neoliberalism is it's not an idealized vision, right? So it's oftentimes you look up something on neoliberalism and you might go to like the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy and you read this very sanitized version of neoliberalism through famous proponents of it, such as Hayek and Friedman. And I think Umurangi generation is far more concerned about the experience of living through it and thus the way that neoliberalism is carried out via the political project of neoliberalism, not just ideally what it ought to be. And in that way, neoliberalism is sort of the connective tissue between a lot of left and right-leaning parties in a lot of countries today. Oftentimes you hear about the climate crisis, the environmental crisis that we're going through, and nonetheless, still, both parties on the left and right are very hesitant to ever get in front of oil companies and expanding pipeline projects. Under Obama, in fact, we had legendary expansions in various pipeline projects, which often had attached to them various organized activist movements against them by Native Americans and First Nation peoples. And so it's very important to call that thread out. But that neoliberalism is fundamentally this sort of like invisible political project to a lot of people that continues to exist. And So, for example, the EPA was also something that kind of rose to dominance or came to be prior to neoliberalism taking over the political scene in the United States and elsewhere through the world. And the EPA is fundamentally something that is incompatible with a lot of neoliberal politics in that it disempowers corporations or capitalist interest and favors the environment, right? And so since the EPA has been founded and over the past 40 years, you've kind of seen a weakening of that institution and also a lot of it rendered somewhat toothless. A lot of corporations and other various powers just continue to ignore them and their various warnings. So what Umurangi generation does is it kind of takes this crisis of neoliberalism that we're in now and runs forward with it. The final key component worth mentioning here to kind of contextualize it in our modern world is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, if I have that correctly, recently released their report on climate change and global warming. And the unfortunate part of this is they gave us kind of a range, a continuum of consequences that we can experience based on the various degrees of warming, right? So 1.5 degrees Celsius warming to 4 degrees Celsius. Previously, we were trying to target 1.5 degrees. We're almost certainly going to blow past that. And again, all the way up to and past 4 degrees Celsius. At 1.5 degrees Celsius, we're going to see mass migrations of people and climate refugees, as certain parts of the world are going to be inhospitable to human life and much animal life. All the way up to 4 degrees Celsius and higher, you have an environment that's been formed that is fundamentally incompatible with organized human life in a lot of places of the world. A lot of wealthier countries will have the means to kind of power through this and make this crisis more comfortable, if you will, but unfortunately it would be absolutely devastating to humans, incalculable human loss, but also an insanely tragic amount of non-human animal loss. We heard about the Australian bushfires in 2020 and 2021. I might have my dates a bit wrong here. But it was absolutely horrific reading about the tragic tales of koalas and other many animals dying in those fires. Billions of animals passed in those fires, painfully, almost certainly. And it's a very painful thing to think about, and the game, instead of ignoring these anxieties, run forwards with them. To the very end, we've blown past 4 degrees Celsius. We're barreling towards the end, right? And this game takes place in the final weeks of that crisis. I've talked for a bit here, Lee. Do you have anything that you would like to say?
Yeah, you're talking about neoliberalism, and I want to relate it back to Umurangi generation, which we've sort of beat around the bush, but we haven't provided sort of concrete examples. And so Umurangi generation is a cyberpunk game. That's the term that Tali uses. I almost kind of don't want to use it. It's simply because modern cyberpunk in many ways is so out of step with sort of the original thrust of what cyberpunk was supposed to be, but nonetheless it fits into the cyberpunk genre. And so we see just a ton of advertising, and as Joseph mentioned, this game is set basically 2 weeks before the end of the world. You just don't know it. And so what you see is that the market is basically saying we can solve this, right? Which is what you see in our world, right? Like the market can solve climate change, and maybe it can. It's just, will the market be able to solve it in time, right? Because stockholders, they got to get their short-term gains, right? And solving climate change, or perhaps rather mitigating climate change at this point is something that requires a sort of de-emphasis on unrestricted capitalism, unrestricted growth, right? And that is fundamentally incompatible with the neoliberal project. So again, going back to Umurangi generation, what we see is all these advertisements. So give me just a second.
There's a beautiful sense of irony in kind of the way that this is presented. The game, right, it is fundamentally, I think in a lot of ways, a cyberpunk tale, but as you go into a level, the Gamer's Palace, as you see some ads for various video games throughout it, there's actually adverts for cyberpunk video games, right? And so in this world, which is fundamentally on a cyberpunk sort of apocalyptic collapse, there are still people looking forward to and playing a cyberpunk game, which is in itself kind of an example of how like a lot of modern cyberpunk media is out of step with the realities that we're in and are focused on maybe a lot of dated anxieties, right? So not that transhumanism isn't something that we're past. I'm sure Elon Musk has a lot of fantastic ideas for enhancing human bodies in various incredible ways because he's a brilliant man and the savior of humanity.
All of them totally shit, by the way. Probably as effective as the Hyperloop. Yeah, go on. Make your point.
Yeah, I don't think Elon Musk has ever heard of trains, but that we'll move beyond that.
Yeah, or subways.
Or subways. But yeah, a lot of cyberpunk media, for me at least, is always, it seems like it's always backward looking, and it's always grappling with the aesthetics of what cyberpunk was in the 80s, right? Which, sure, there's gross Orientalism, but the aesthetics are now kind of the point. The kind of blaring neon, the very like anomalous Asian-centric corporations dominating the landscape. These are often used for escapist means and are often not even like used critically, right?
And let me just jump in here real quick. Like, one of the things that irritates me about modern cyberpunk is that you have, you'll have like advertisements in Japanese, or there'll be like ramen, but like so very rarely do you actually see an actual fucking Asian person in modern cyberpunk. Like, at least like old cyberpunk had the courtesy to stick in an Asian villain. At least Deus Ex gave me an Asian villain. Like, modern cyberpunk is so devoid of any actual brown experience that it feels like doubly racist in a sense. Like, one, the racism is outdated, and then two, the objects of the racism aren't even there. They've been excised out of the narrative. It's so annoying. Anyways, go on. Sorry.
It's very frustratingly, but yeah, it's sort of, I can't think of any better way to put it. A lot of modern cyberpunk is sort of a white man's version of escapism in a lot of ways. It's often a violent tale of how a singular individual it gets into a win state via the movie, the TV series, or the video game through violent means and enhancing their body. And so it oftentimes, by its own mechanics, fails to be a successful critique of itself or the systems that it's trying to critique. How can you critique transhumanism while also wholeheartedly embracing it, right? And that is without getting into the very messy ways that LGBT and especially trans people are represented in a lot of cyberpunk media, which is abhorrent, but we don't have time to get into all that, nor the expertise to really delve into it. And I think that Umurangi Generation is very successful here. This is a first-person shooter, but you're shooting pictures. You're not shooting people. You're fundamentally incapable of stopping the apocalypse. You're not a one-man army. All right. I guess some cyberpunk games are diverse enough to now let you choose females, or other people. But yeah, you're not a one-person army. You can't stop the apocalypse, and there's nothing that you can really do about it. And it kind of sidesteps a lot of that gross, again, Orientalism and sort of racist or racial Asian portrayals. And to me, that makes Umurangi Generation a vision for how cyberpunk games can and probably should be executed moving forward if it wants to kind of gain that punk aspect to it, right? There's been an overemphasis on the cyber part of cyberpunk, but without losing that kind of punk edge. What are you rebelling against? Are you rebelling against kind of outdated visions of the future from the 80s, or are you really grappling with the realities that we're going through today? And I think Umurangi Generation really understands that in order to be a cyberpunk game, to have legitimacy, you need that kind of punk's edge.
And so much of what you're rebelling against, this is to backtrack, but also track, I guess, move forward a little bit, is plastered in the game. There's all these advertisements, again, the apocalypse is coming, right? Like, but life sort of limps on just like it does in real life. So, if you're tired of hearing all these noises, all this gunfire, just, soundproof your house. Is climate change causing your house to be flooded? Well, we'll just make the whole freaking place float, and then there's also this sort of like rah-rah patriotism, like, if there's rubble, help clean it up, do your part, but all of this sort of fails to address why there is persistent gunfire, why climate change is happening, why there's rubble, why there is unrest. And I think that's just, again, what makes it brilliant. And then you sort of see, Jeff mentioned earlier, the Gamer's Palace level, which is where basically you have people that are the haves basically are sort of trying to wait out the apocalypse underground in this sort of nightclub plus arcade sort of situation. And in one corner, this is my favorite part, because you see this happening where you see fascist people, right? Because this is very much a part of this game is fascism. Fascist people reappropriating, reconfiguring leftist talking points. In this case, it's a fashion store, right? Called Topsiders. It's misspelled or whatever, And they're like, this is what the rebellion wears, man. But it's in a place that's very far removed from the actual rebellion of the top side, where people are poor and desolate and exist outside the quote unquote confines of society. And, in the back, there's even like a sign, I think, that says, don't graffiti or something like that, right? Which is one of the ways that people are sort of rebelling against this neoliberal end of the world, is that they're expressing themselves because they don't really have any other options. And so, again, we go back to the idea of identity. When your identity is when those in charge don't want you to be yourself, just being able to express yourself is truly, truly a radical act.
Yeah, I love that Gamer's Palace mission and how it sort of it brings up a lot of the issues within the gaming scene, but particularly that Topsiders clothing is sort of a brilliant way in which there are kind of capitalist appropriations of various movements to sell products, right? You had, during the Black Lives Matter explosion in 2020, you had a lot of gross sort of corporations jumping in on it and trying to find ways to like productize or even profit off of it, right? And to me, that spoke brilliantly to a lot of trends that are often observed. This all gets into how Umurangi generation talks about how neoliberalism responds to crisis, and that it's fundamentally incapable of doing so, because responding to the crisis would also be responding to sort of the corporatist capitalist class or means of expansion and growth. And so it's not about, to address these issues, right, you would need to address the ecological collapse, to address the inequality, to do all of these various things, you would have to step in and go in conflict with a lot of the sort of capitalist intent at the center of the system. And so it's not about actually dealing with the core issues, it's about finding comfort in the situation, right? So you have posters throughout the game, such as the New Sydney poster. It's like, and it says, it's like the old one, but not underwater. Or is your home about to go underwater? We can make it float. You have I would not be shocked if the gun ad or the phrase you said about guns was also in there. But yeah, the political class, the corporate class, is oftentimes in this just trying to produce a sense of comfort and sort of find ways to move away from the actual central conflict. A lot of the kind of fascist conservative talking hosts and even political figures talk about how, like, we're seeing less monsters now. We're seeing less kaiju. So we must be successful. Like, this is going very well, obviously. And yeah, so this system is very clearly, as is the world, kind of careening on collapse. And so as this game moves forward, you get closer and closer to the overall collapse. And so one particular moment that's really poignant to me in this game is the final mission, where all of the system comes under collapse. Everyone, not everyone, but a lot of people on the top side are, disillusioned with the situation. They're frustrated with how they've been disenfranchised. They're not listened to, and they're also just exposed outside to exist in the brunt of the situation as it goes on. It's worth noting at this point, we keep saying top side, right? So in the DLC for the game, you learn that a lot of the wealthier people have kind of like the wealthier class of people have escaped underground into a sort of underground setting that calls to Neon Genesis Evangelion and other prior influences. Whereas a lot of the other people in the world are kind of like left to their own devices and to deal with, again, the brunt of the situation, including nuclear bombing runs and other things that often have large human collateral. And so this whole system comes to a collapse at the end of the game, the very final mission, when there's a protest being held underground by a lot of people on the top side, asking for, attention to hear them out, but also to vent their frustrations at the system. And you can see this in a lot of the graffiti that's being written throughout the level. There were fascists before the 20th century. Peaceful protest equal riots. Kaiju equals natural cause. Learn to live with it. Stop killing us. Cry over property damage, but silent on the collateral. Yeah, okay. So you get the message that like the capitalist class is worried more about their capital, their shareholders, or what have you.
And this, I just want to jump in real quick and say this is the part where if you didn't get the message in the first 11 levels of the game, he has literally scrawled it out for you on the walls of this level. And then this is also the part where I will just say I have to moderate what I say on this part. And so what the talking points that Jeff has just outlined, there are some much more on the nose, no hold bars, smoking aces sort of comments. So I encourage you, if this is something that you're interested in, you're like, this game, they're pulling their punches. This game does not pull punches at all. We are pulling punches in this very specific instance.
And so I love how the game ends, right? And so in a statement of finality, the mechs created to protect humanity and fight off the kaiju are turned against the protesters to subdue us. The weapons we create for use on others will always be used on us. This is a lesson of history. And there is no escape from the violence. This is the game's most impactful and most destroying moment. The kaiju outside did not end us. The ecological collapse, as tragic as it was, did not end us. We did. The kaiju were always just a metaphor for the environment fighting back, but ultimately we were our greatest enemies. And I love the way that the game lines this message up.
Yeah, I do too. And before we sort of move on to sort of our final points about sort of what the game is trying to say with its mechanics and where it sort of fits into the larger history of video games and art and all those other great conversations, I just want to talk about the F word, fascism, right? I brought it up. I don't think we really properly explained it, but that is something that the game is very much concerned about, is how neoliberalism sort of, if unrestricted capitalism and sort of the idea that the market can solve everything, if we allow that idea to go to its sort of natural conclusion, can lead to a fascist power structure. And again, going back to the gamer's palace level, that is something that we see in there. And it's worth noting that Gamer's Palace is one of the 4 DLC levels, and there's definitely a tonal shift, right? In the first 8 or so acts, there's sort of like a melancholy sadness, but in like the last 4 levels, Talia is fucking pissed, right? And so, this is, by the time this comes out, we've been with 6 months of COVID, 6 months of people saying, denying and not wearing masks, like, just all sorts of horrific stuff. So anyways, what we see is that alongside all of these like fun things like playing video games and everything, there's all these fascist talking points. And I think I just want to bring that up because fascism, we tend to think of it as sort of like this outdated, or at least we used to before January 6th, this sort of thing that maybe happened in Italy in the 1950s with Mussolini, but it never really went away. And that America has always sort of had there's, we all often talk about 2 Americas, where there's often been this sort of desire for fascism that we've sort of whitewashed away. If it's not been expressed at the national level, it's certainly been expressed with groups like the KKK, like the Proud Boys, just like any pick a nationalist far-right militia group, right? And troubling for us, for me and Jeff, and I think for a lot of people, and one of the reasons why I just turn voice chat off when I play video games, is that increasingly video games are a place for recruitment, for fascism, for fascist movements. So I'm just going to read three quick quotes real quick, just to prove I'm not talking out of my ass. So one is from journalist Chris Edges, who remarks that fascist movements build their base not from the politically active, but the politically inactive. The losers who feel, often correctly, that they have no voice or role to play in the political establishment. And then another good quote is by Professor Megan Condis. So in a 2019 New York Times op-ed, she wrote, "Recruiters go to where targets are, staging seemingly casual conversations about issues of race and identity in a space where lots of disaffected, vulnerable, adolescent white males tend to hang out." Those who exhibit curiosity about white nationalist talking points or express frustration with the alt right's ideological opponents, such as feminists, anti racism activists, and social justice warriors, are then escorted through a funnel of increasingly racist rhetoric designed to normalize the presence of white supremacist ideology and paraphernalia through the use of edgy humor and memes. And I know what you're thinking, what do these two eggheads know? All right, I present you with quote number 3, Steve fucking Bannon. He once remarked, quote, "You can activate that army. They come in through Gamergate or whatever, and then get turned onto politics and Trump." And so again, going back to the idea of settler colonialism, right? That mindset that never really went away. And a lot of that has sort of infiltrated its way insidiously behind the scenes into sort of the way we view other people, other being whatever, just fill in the blank there. And so, yeah, the sort of progeny of that idealism is, intense, just like a feminist, anti-racism activist, social justice warriors. We also see the deification of manly men who just want to do manly things to get things done, which is a very fascist thing to say, right? If you think about what's his name, Vladimir Putin, right, or any sort of autocratic leader. They never want to be seen as feminine, So I'm sorry, I've rambled. Jeff, do you want to jump in and save me from myself?
The Jeff is perfect for saving everything. So I love how you brought in the discussion of fascism, which is a key part in the dialogue of this game. Not literally dialogue, because there is no dialogue really in this game, but like a lot of what the game is trying to cover. And it's very important to note, as you did, that fascism is not something that just existed in Nazi Germany or in Italy during World War II, but it's something that existed before and exists after. And certainly there have been modern neo-fascist movements, right? To read off real quickly here to help kind of give a coherent understanding of like what fascism is. And there are many academics who study fascism, and that is their core topic, right? And I cannot provide the sort of authority on the topic as many can. But, these are some common components that I think many would agree are parts of fascism, right? So a charismatic and all-powerful leader, known as the Führer, right? Complete social control, often totalitarianism. Prevalent xenophobia and a superiority complex, often kind of comes in as racism and hatred towards others not from the country. Do I need to say build the wall? Imperial or expansionist tendencies. I think that's often known as Lebensraum, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And then a sense of elitism and futurism, often kind of manifesting as techno-optimism, right? And I don't need to break each of these down and provide in numerous examples, but each of these kind of core components of fascism you can kind of see emerging in a lot of societies, which is problematic, and this game is sort of about the way that capitalism, when running rampant, when neoliberalism, without any kind of brakes or controls, can kind of pervert into fascism, can manifest as fascism, right? And it's, again, important to think of fascism as not something that is just the Nazis committing large-scale genocide or Italy, but is something that can exist, Italy of World War II, can exist today in various different means, right? And so I think that is important in the dialogue of this game, and that the way that people are commonly indoctrinated into fascism now, into neo-fascist movements or white supremacy movements, such as the Proud Boys, a lot of the advocacy is done online, right? And you can actually even find like pro-fascist subreddits if you want to on Reddit, right? It's not hard to find these organizations and groups, and gaming is a large part of that. What starts as edgy humor often leads people down the road to fascism. And so I think that Umurangi generation fortunately has a lot to say on this topic, because it is a critical topic. But there's so much that Umurangi's generation says on so many things, more than we really have time for, given what we're trying to present. And I think that's what makes Umurangi Generation such a special game. It is a game that really covers the gamut and tells a story much larger than a small personal narrative. But it's a game about living through and trying to make sense of the world that we live in now. And that you can't say that we're the Red Sky generation, right? But maybe we're the generation before it. And Umurangi generation's message to us is we got to clean up our act. We got to get it together, or things are going to get real nasty, right? We may not have kaiju emerging from the waters, but as the game shows, we don't really need kaiju to end ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, just a couple of inches of sea level rise is really all it takes at this point. We're nearing the end of this discussion, and again, as Jeff said, there's a lot of ground to cover that we haven't covered, or that perhaps we've covered inelegantly. But I do want to focus on one last thing, if you'll bear with me for perhaps another 10 minutes, Jeff. I know it's getting hot under this blanket. Sorry, blankets. We're not sharing the same blanket. We are in
premium soundproofing technology that is soft is how I refer to it.
There you go. Yeah. So, and that is the game mechanics itself. I want to focus on the game's mechanics. And so, we've talked about, engaging in dialogue, but there's no dialogue, that you're a Maori courier and all that other stuff. And in many ways, this is the mechanics of the game are perhaps not as radical as its message or sort of representing Maori people, modern Maori people authentically, but it is also just really, really cool and really special, and something that I don't want to gloss over. So one of the cool things about this game is the way it sort of interacts with the sort of like, are video games art, or video games not art sort of dialogue that was sort of like famously, I want to say, summed up or perhaps attracted a lot of attention by Roger Ebert in 2010. And, I think you made some rather salient points, and those points have been refuted and whatnot. And I don't want to get into it because the man is no longer with us, so that seems kind of unfair. But two salient points that I want to mention is that he argued that video games can't be art because the experience is so malleable because of player choice, that any sort of idea that they're trying to express is going to naturally be weakened. So the example he used is Romeo and Juliet, but with a happy ending, which he said performed terribly, right? And also because games are driven by win states, they can't really be considered artistic expressions, So games, they're caught in this double bind where, if they conform to traditional game-like behaviors like chess, they're dismissed as toys. But if they push the envelope, they get negative criticism for failing to be sufficiently game-like. Frequently that criticism, ironically enough, comes from the sort of the fascist corners of the internet. We're like, oh no, they put like a black woman on the front of a game. It's the end of white society as we know it, and it's not even that radical of an act. They just want to sell to a sizable portion of the America's population. So, but anyways,
or a more common example, right? Or a more recent example, right? Is there have been various big AAA games in the past year or two that have had prominent female protagonists that have often been very large and muscly, and the gaming community's response to that in very conservative and fascist corners was not friendly and not good.
Yeah, exactly. And so also I just want to point out that Roger Ebert's views, at least as late back in 2010, were shared by video game author Hideo Kojima, right? So it's not like this is like a totally fringe idea, and there are people in the video game industry that see this. And I'm going to guess, based on Kojima's tweets and everything, he probably still holds this view. So, but the way that Umurangi generation engages with this dialogue, not intentionally, I think, is really cool. Like the game notes that art is subjective. And so, apart from taking photographs of blue bottles, which we'll get to towards the end of this video, the game doesn't really make any judgment calls about what you're photographing. There are rules in the game, but they're rules in so much as they're real world rules that replicate what it's like to use a DSLR camera and post-processing and all that other good stuff. As the developer himself notes, how does the computer know the intentions of a photographer? It simply can't, at least not where we're at right now. So the only scoring from the game comes from capturing the objects that the game wants you to capture, which can usually be done from multiple locations. Like it might say something like property or view in, capture property or view in, and it's located in multiple different ways. And then sort of B, as an optional, is photographing everything within a time limit, which you don't even have to do. That's totally optional. And so what this does is it forces you to look and observe and engage with the environment. You have to walk around the space and you have to understand what that space means to the people inside of it. So you have this core gameplay loop that is forcing players to interact with the game's core narrative in a way that few games do, but I think a lot of art museums, galleries, and artists do. And so it's getting closer to what is that art thing. And then so on the other sort of flip side of it, in terms of narrative, in terms of trying to be deep, which is I think what a lot of people think of when they think of our video games art is, are they deep, right? You know? And for example, I just beat Deathloop, right? Which at the like sort of alludes to climate change throughout sort of like some drops, and if you some lore drops, and if you pick a particular ending, you see that the world outside the island that you're on is probably ravaged by or has been ravaged by climate change. Nothing about me teleporting around stabbing motherfuckers with machetes. It forces me to engage with the ramifications of climate change. And in fact, I could probably not even not engage with any of the lore, like stick my fingers in my ear and go la 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 la, and I wouldn't even know that it was about climate change. That's not an option in Umurangi generation. Like, players have to frame what they see, and so over time they begin to frame outside the objectives and they experience the story from a new perspective. And so by taking photos, you sort of tie yourself to this world, and it's a very cool way of A, reinforcing the message, B, engaging with that art. Can video games be art dialogue? And then C, because you're forced to do this through repetition, really sticking this message home and making it stay with you. So
yeah, you mind if I summarize that real quickly, Lee?
Yeah, knock yourself out.
So in summary, Roger Ebert never played a walking simulator, so he doesn't have that kind of advanced notion of art in video games. Just joking there. Secondly, I think that a lot of what you said kind of stuck out to me, but in particular, how the mechanics of a particular game can form a literal island within the game that doesn't force or cause you to engage with like the larger systems that it might or might not trying to be to represent, right? You can have a traditional first-person shooter where you're killing a million things and teleporting around, like you said, that may have like a deep political narrative or might have like a lot of great environmental storytelling. But the way that the game itself is structured doesn't really encourage or even really cause you to engage with a lot of that other stuff, right? Additionally, they're in a very meta level, Umurangi generation, there is no win state. Like, there isn't. Like, the world ends, the protest ends in violence, like everything ends in violence and corruption and terror. There is literally no win state in this game, right? And the game even smirks at it a little bit, like in the tutorial, right? Like how you can take photos in any way that you want and still be successful. Like, winning is very arbitrary in this game throughout every aspect of it, right? It's like the game is almost custom built to kind of like refute the notion of like what a win state could be or is.
Yeah, I agree. So the point that I just want to leave on talking about games and art and sort of the mechanics is, this isn't a point that the game ruminates on a lot, but I think it is a very interesting point to end on. Go back to those pictures of the blue bottles. You're not supposed to take pictures of the blue bottles because that is sort of a reminder of where things at, where things are headed. And, people don't want you to think about them. And the game is, I think, in a way concerned about sort of the role of media in a time of crisis, the role of, what can a gig economy person do in a time of crisis, because you are working in the gig economy in this game. The game forces you to put productivity and process ahead of creativity to sort of like beat the level. And there's this real underscoring of the tension between art and commerce, getting a paycheck and telling the truth, and what can you even do in a neoliberal system where you are at like the very, very, very bottom of the pecking order. And I think what the game sort of shows through its levels, through what you see your friends doing, is that sometimes you just gotta fucking party. That's part of it. You just gotta live. But also there is a real value in making art and engaging with the artistic process. And that, sort of like the actual final level of the DLC, that that art, that photography can actually be a very powerful way of getting the message out of course, the issue is that this game is set 2 weeks before the end of the world, and the weapons of the state have been turned on its people by the form of a giant mech. And while the pen is certainly mightier than the sword, I'm fairly certain that the camera is not more powerful than an evil one mech. So with that, Jeff, do you have any concluding thoughts before we wrap this up?
Yes. In a normal cyberpunk game, you see a lot of neon signs and advertisements for corporations, right? And in a loose way and oftentimes messy ways that these traditional cyberpunks are trying to critique capitalism and other things in their own ways. But in Umurangi Generation, you see that too. You see signs for Gamers Palace, you see signs for a lot of products, but you also see neon paint everywhere for people representing themselves and their situation, their thoughts and their beliefs, right? You can scarcely go through a level without seeing some beautiful neon graffiti in a lot of different locations, and you see more of it than a lot of the sort of ads in the game for various things. And I think this is meaningful and it's telling, right? That we make art to digest and to comprehend our reality, but also kind of work through the situations that we're in, right? And so this game kind of posits a lot of thoughts about what to do at the end of the world. And one of them is party, but also another one is to make art as a means of getting through the apocalypse, the collapse, and the calamities kind of going through everyone every day. The game is, in a way, it's about the beauty of people and the things that we create, right? There is hope at the center of this game, and it's what makes playing this game a very unique experience. We've spent, the better part of an hour talking about like the apocalyptic nature of this game and how it can be crushing to play. But when you play it, that's not necessarily the experience that you always get, right? You're surrounded by your friends in the game, or they're always with you, at least in the level. You spot a lot of graffiti. It's much more complicated than just crushing, kind of like life is itself. And so things are complex, and making art is cool.
Yeah, and I sincerely hope that everyone that if you've made it this far, that you go and check it out. Again, it's only 6 hours, if that. I think it's 6 hours with going back and sort of doing some of the bonus stuff to get some cooler lenses and everything. But if you are interested in what what are and what they can be, it's sort of like this sort of larger history of games, even outside the sort of depressing stuff that Jeff and I have talked about with neoliberalism and ecological collapse. I highly recommend this game. With that being said, we have done 3 depressing episodes. It's been a very depressing 18 months, I think, for both of us. And so, not both. I mean, there are moments of joy, right? But generally, it's been an exhausting, COVID-filled 2 years at this point. So I think we're looking forward to playing something very, very uplifting. So I think the next episode might be out of this world, you might say.
Might
Jeff?
be out of this world and many others. Might be, yeah.
Yes.
So in our next episode, get ready for some space travel, some puzzle solving, and some amazing storytelling as we get ready for the Outer Wilds.
Unless we change our minds. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.
Jesus Christ.
It's like, after being under this blanket for like over an hour, it feels like I just opened, like air like coming in is like fresh. And it's just kind of like steamy and balmy in here, like in an uncomfortable way.
In my head, like where I'm at, it's summer in the Midwest. But in my feet, it's fall on the left coast. It's 2 different seasons. It's very, yeah. Okay. All right. I'm ready.